Welcome to Cultures TV, your hidden diversity resource. I'm Donnie Luckett, and we're here today with a number of guests to discuss hidden diversity and its importance in the 21st century. So our guests are
I'm Andrea Buzwan.
I'm Eric O'Neill.
Kate Warmus.
Kendall McElhaney.
Sydney Shawls.
nice. Glad to have you all here today. So, this is a topic that's becoming more and more important. I see it on TV all the time. I hear it on the radio all the time. I've lived it my entire life, as have you all. So that's what we're here about today, is to find out what that meant for you and what it was about. So let's start with Kendall. What is hidden diversity to you?
To me, hidden diversity is the favorite part of everyone's story. You know, it's the little thing about them that makes them unique, and it's that little special part that they hold dear because it's part of their experience.
Oh, nice. I like it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say that hidden diversity has to do more with how society reacts to us as individuals and our identities than necessarily how we feel about those identities.
I like
So I
that.
think it's hidden not to ourselves, but really to the society out there, and depending on which segment of society we're interacting with at the time.
Nice. I like it. How about you, Sydney?
Hidden diversity to me was more about how I grew up. So my stepfather immigrated from Mexico when he was 8 years old, and so both of my brothers are Hispanic, and he and my mom have been together since I was 3 years old, and so people would, come up and be like, yeah, this is my brother, and they were like, you're Mexican? And I was like, no, he's my brother, though. It wasn't weird to me, but it was, abnormal to everybody else, so that's kind of how I grew up. I feel like that's why hidden diversity is a part of me.
Interesting. And then Eric.
I think hidden diversity to me, kind of going off what everybody else has said, is just kind of the diversity that only you know, that not necessarily society knows. Kind of what Sydney was saying, she's got a Hispanic stepfather. And it's just, the different little pieces of you that make up who you are that aren't necessarily obvious to everybody else.
So do you agree with all of this, Andrea, or do you have a different definition?
What's interesting to me is that I think it does matter. Your perspective on it matters depending on your complexion. So I think Kate's comment that it depends on what society is thinking of you. Kate feels that she feels perfectly fitting in with her life, and yet other people may have a reaction to how she looks. Where somebody like me who has a lighter complexion, it's the opposite. Something more like what you have said, where maybe it's something special inside of me. And it's important to me. It's part of who I am. It's part of what makes me unique, and yet you wouldn't necessarily know by looking at my face.
Exactly. And, you make a great point about complexion, because I have it too. I grew up, I'm what's called a TCK. Our audience knows this. I'm a third culture kid. So I grew up around the world, 7 countries by the time I was an adult. But people look at me and they think I'm African American. But my father's Costa Rican, my mother's Trinidadian, and we have a rainbow in our family. So that makes a difference, because when you look at me, you expect certain things to happen, and they don't happen. It's like, you're strange. Well, I'm actually not strange. You just thought I was strange because you had a different idea of who I would be. So what is your story, Eric?
Well, my story, I'm Irish American. Both my parents are Caucasian. But what makes me hiddenly diverse is I've gone to inner city high schools, or not high schools, just schools my entire life. So at all my schools that I've attended, I've been a minority. So it's different than what a lot of Caucasian males experience growing up, just being a minority in their high school. So I think it's kind of changed my view on the world, just getting to interact with people from all over the world. I think it's changed my perspective, just giving me a better perspective on the world and how other people see it. So.
And that's really what it's about.
Yeah.
I mean, it's about broadening your mind, and the 21st century is different than the 20th or 19th or 18th, obviously. But in this perspective, I think we've made a huge leap. And so for Kate, what is your story?
Well, I have been multiracial all my life. But I did only grow up with one of my parents, and I grew up in a very rural, very Caucasian kind of environment. And so I think in the same way you were talking about, society expects something from my behavior and my way of speaking just based on my appearance. And because I've grown up in such an environment, that's where my roots are, that's where my culture is. And so I have a different perspective on the world than what is expected of me. And also the influences, both explicit and implicit, that I received from my upbringing, from my parents, about what I what I am, how I define myself, and how I interact with the world as well.
Yes.
Have affected all of my perspective.
I love that, and I understand. I'm sure we all understand completely. So what about you, Kendall?
Well, I grew up in a little town in Texas, so that is not a very diverse place. But however, where I do find my hidden diversities was the communities that I was engaging in and how I self-identified. And so, though I may not look it, I'm half Cherokee. So that is a big part of me. I don't really talk about it that much because I didn't grow up learning a lot about it. But especially on my journey now in my young adulthood, I'm growing more towards that culture, and I'm trying to understand more about that side of my life. But in my journey so far with hidden diversity, it's been more about where I fit with the LGBT community. And there's a lot of hidden diversity in that community. There's a lot of people, a lot of individuals who identify different than the majority. And it's just beautiful to hear everyone's stories and hear their journeys and what's led them to identifying the way that they do. It's just a very honest and genuine place. So
I love what, and many of you have mentioned it. It's not how I look,
yeah.
And that's the difference between visual diversity and hidden diversity, especially in America, but pretty much around the world. I mean, back in the day when slavery kind of changed and darker people became slaves instead of just everyone being an indentured, or whomever lost a war or whatever was an indentured servant, it was easier to tell who was a slave because of your skin color. Well, now in the 21st century, that doesn't work anymore. Society has changed, life has changed, our outlook has changed, and people have changed, our experiences have changed. So it's time that people understand that you can't just make an assessment. What you see is not necessarily what you get. So how did this affect you all growing up? Who wants to chime in first?
Well, one thing I think is really interesting about having a certain identity that's inside you is that it's something that is very individual. So it doesn't mean that the other, like my brother, for example, so we have the same parents, one white father, one Latina mother, and yet that we really identify somewhat differently. I would say that my Latina side is very important to me. I took great pains to learn Spanish. I studied abroad. I did lots of things to really go and learn about my family, and I felt that this is really who I am. And my brother, although he does speak a little Spanish, it's not really part of his, identity. It's not what he needs to feel like a whole person. And so that's something that I think is interesting about being mixed in some way, is that it's for you and it's about you, and that's why you can't make assumptions. You really have to take the time to learn somebody's story first.
Right. Very good. Very good. Anybody else?
For me, it was a little bit different. I think I grew up in a primarily Caucasian suburbia. And, the difference for me was it was more of a culture clash. So my mom's family is very, Caucasian
And
rituals,
Midwestern,
holidays.
right?
Yes, and
Yeah.
Midwestern, holidays. And then we have Jaime, where his family is, it's very Hispanic, like very family oriented, and everybody really depends on each other, and it was just so much different because he's my stepfather, so I was my mom's. I didn't learn Spanish, but his son learned Spanish, and so it was almost like a house divided, but little things would come in from each culture, and I think that's what makes me different.
Nice. I like that. And so growing up, did you experience anything, Kate? Where did you say you grew up? What state?
I grew up in Maine.
Okay. Oh, okay. So
Yes.
that even nationally, there's different cultures, and that's why I have that reaction, because Maine is so much different than New York City or LA. So what
Exactly.
was it like growing
Yeah.
up there?
Well, actually, I felt very, very much at home in Maine, and I still very much feel as though that is my home, and I feel very appreciated and welcomed there because that is the Maine culture. So they look more at who the person is and where they come from
Oh, I
than
love
really, complexion.
I've been meaning to go up there. I guess I should take a trip.
Exactly. It's a wonderful, wonderful place. And so really, the shock for me came when I left the state. And I realized that not everywhere in the world was so welcoming in that way. And a lot of people meeting me for the first time hadn't known my family, hadn't known my story, and so they asked a lot of questions. And it was when I left the state that I had to answer all of these questions, and I didn't know how to answer them. And so I turned to my parents, and they explained to me then that it was about race. I was getting questions about
Wow.
race, and I had to learn at a very young age what it meant to be who I am, not only the different races that I'm comprised of, but what it meant to be a multiracial person and kind of stand on my own. And that was not something that my parents could do
teach
for
you,
me.
yeah.
I had to really develop that for myself. And because I am of the age that I was really in the middle of the baby boom, for the biracial baby boom, there wasn't a lot of others, a lot of role models to look up to, a lot of mentors to explain this kind of experience for me. And now I'm seeing, as I get older and more multiracial, students and children and my own children are growing up, it's something that's a normalized part of their experience. They have words to describe it. They have, histories and people to point to. They have the President of the United States to look up to. And so they're not having the same struggles that I did, and that's both a beautiful thing, but also very much a challenging thing for myself, because I feel as we move forward as a society, my experiences are sort of left behind. They're history now. And so there's not a lot of people to relate to in that struggle, even though there's more people to relate to in identity.
Right. Well, I like that you say, that you have to describe to people what this is. That's what makes it hidden. Kendall, you talk about the LGBT community, and we've talked before that I was at a diversity conference actually recently, and they talked about the LGBT community, they talked about all the different races, which in America it tends to be, multiculturalism tends to be more about race and not necessarily just about culture. So, at the beginning of the day I was all excited because it seemed fresh and new. It's not like you're in 1980s diversity, right? But toward the end of the day I got a little bit depressed because it actually was just a rehashing of the same old, the 20th century thinking. And I ended up speaking with the presenter, who was great, and she was really good. Actually, she's more like us. She's very hiddenly diverse, I was about to say, but she has hidden diversity. And we chatted about my experience, and I said, I don't fit in any of these boxes you have up here. So if I don't fit out there and I don't fit in here, it's just, of course I'm going to be depressed, correct? So I said, everything you've talked about, the only thing I can identify with is the LGBT community. And she was just proud and beaming and nodded her head, and I said, but I am not part of that community. And so she kind of was like, what? She didn't know where to go with that. And I think the difference is it's hidden. You have to tell people how to be with you because they don't understand. They're looking visually. And your parents can't help you with it. They don't come from this background. They can't help you as you grow up and explain how things should be different. So for you, Kendall, what was that like? Do you have anything like that?
I totally agree with you. The LGBT community is a very prominent hidden diversity. It's one that a lot of people can identify with, but they identify with it a little later in life than most. Like a TCK, a third culture kid, someone who's experiencing that journey, living somewhere out of their passport culture. It's a lot easier for them to recognize, okay, I don't exactly assimilate with everyone around me, but there's some kind of connection I have with them. And it's the same thing with this community. And that's why I relate so well to TCKs, because this community is something that is not something you can just tell by looking at someone. And it's not something that you should be able to tell by looking at someone. Right. You shouldn't make assumptions. That's another conversation. But what I'm trying to get at is that hidden diversity is a beautiful thing because it allows you to express yourself in your own journey. And whether you identify as someone in the community or you are a TCK or you've grown up with different kind of parents, it doesn't matter because it allows you to be yourself and say, I identify this way, and that gives me a connection with you. You may have a completely different story than me, but because there's something about us that makes us unique that isn't...
We're actually kind of the same.
Exactly, something that isn't typically experienced by a lot of people, that gives us some kind of connection. And it's great because then communities can intersect.
Yes.
And
yes.
That's fun.
I want to piggyback a little bit because I have noticed in my own experience somewhat of a flip side to that beauty, which, for me, it's such a wonderful and empowering thing to be able to choose my own identity, to say this is who I am and to express myself how I choose. But what I find sometimes is a resistance towards that freedom of choice where somebody can say, I don't get to choose who I am. I'm just who I am. Why do you think that you can just move and shift? And, why is it okay for you to call yourself Andrea with these people, but Andrea with these other people? Why is that okay? And I've gotten a lot of resistance from that,
Yeah.
which I find, disappointing because it doesn't harm anyone else. It's just who I am. I'm expressing myself. So what harm is there in that?
I've had that, and I had to tell people, it's my name. I get to tell you how to say it. So now you're quiet over there, the only man at the table. Tell us, I mean, your experience was a little bit different than everyone else, so tell us about that.
Definitely.
Different but the same,
So yeah, I mean, kind of just what I said before. I just grew up in a pretty dominantly Caucasian neighborhood, but I went to school in inner city schools.
So how was that? Did you have to like shift, or did you feel like you had to shift back and forth?
Yeah, I mean, kind of. It was kind of just how I grew up, though, because starting from when I was 5 years old, I mean, I was with people from all around the world going to school every day, 5 days a week. So it wasn't anything, it wasn't like a culture shock or anything for me. It was just, I had friends from all around the world, and I just kind of grew up that way. And my parents are very accepting of all ethnicities and races and cultures and everything. So I never had a clash with any of that. So it's just, it wasn't weird to me or anything like that. That's just how I grew up and how I lived.
See, and
so.
this is how the world should be.
Right.
This is how the world should be. So that brings us to the end of the program today. We'll have many more times to talk about hidden diversity, what it means, and what it means for the 21st century. But until then, remember that at Cultures, we speak your language.